to keep their flock securely in the fold. Despite the fact that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus teaches everyone, when his training is complete, will reach his teacher's level, the Gnostic idea that Christianity was about oneself becoming a Christ became branded as blasphemous heresy. The role of the Gnostic master was to undermine all of an initiate's opinions and encourage them to directly confront the mystery of life. The role of the literalist bishops, on the other hand, was to tell people what to believe and to discipline those who disagreed. Free intellectual inquiry was actively discouraged, and blind belief became exalted as a spiritual virtue. As long as the Jesus story was understood as myth, Christians were at liberty to interpret it and change it as they felt appropriate. Once it became seen as a biography, the development of intolerant dogmatism was inevitable. Literalists would argue vehemently for centuries over what Jesus actually did and said, as they still do today. But as the argument is about supposed historical events, they all agree that there is only one accurate version of what really happened. And if only one version is right, that means everyone else must be wrong. Forged lineage. From the large number of Christian scriptures in existence, literalists selected 4 Gospels to form the Canon of the New Testament. These Gospels were then declared to be the only authentic Gospels, and all of the other Christian scriptures were denounced as heretical. The 4 New Testament Gospels are variations on the Jesus myth originally used by different schools of Christian Gnosticism. Putting them together created the illusion of there being 4, albeit contradictory, eyewitness accounts of the same historical events. The later triumph of literalism has left us with the distorted impression that these Gospels were always the most popular Christian scriptures. But this is not true. In fact, we don't hear anything about Matthew, Mark, Luke and John until the late 2nd century. To endorse their authority, literalist bishops fabricated a lineage connecting themselves back to the fictional disciples of the Gospels. They turned Paul from the great messenger of the Christian Gnostics into a bastion of literalism by simply forging letters in his name, which make him condemn their Gnostic rivals. It's a simple trick, but it worked. It was not until the last few centuries that scholarship became sophisticated enough to see through it. Literalists also co-opted to their cause later Christian philosophers, such as the 2nd century writers Athenagoras of Athens, Theophilus of Antioch, and Minucius Felix of Africa. These writers actually promoted a philosophical Christianity based around the mythical figures of the Logos and Sophia. Not only were they not literalists, they were not even particularly interested in the figure of Jesus. Athenagoras claims to go minutely into the particulars of Christian doctrine, yet never mentions Jesus at all. Neither does Minucius Felix, even when an adversary asks him to name someone who has actually returned from the dead. Instead, he gives a list of diabolical beliefs and practices that have been wrongly attributed to Christians. These include, along with drinking the blood of sacrificed children and worshipping the genitals of priests, worshipping a man who suffered death as some criminal as well as a wretched piece of wood. As he comments, "These and similar indecencies we do not wish to hear. It is disgraceful to have to defend ourselves against such charges. When you attribute to us the worship of a criminal and his cross, you wander far from the truth." Indeed, Minucius condemns pagan literalists who choose a man for their worship, and Theophilus ridicules pagan literalists for believing that Hercules and Asclepius had actually come back from the dead. Why did literalists try and adopt to their cause writers who were so obviously promoting something quite different? Because there are no early Christian writers who defend the idea of there literally being an historical Jesus. There were no historical disciples. There were no early literalists. They all had to be invented. The earliest Christian whose writings suggest he was a literalist was Justin Martyr, circa 150. But even Justin still saw Christianity as a branch of philosophy and set up his own philosophical school in Rome. After Justin's death, His pupil Tatian abandoned his master's literalism, suggesting that it was seen as something of an innovation, and regarded the Jesus story as comparable to Greek myths, urging his pagan readers, "Compare your own stories with our narratives. Take a look at your own records and accept us merely on the grounds that we too tell stories." International Christian Gnosticism. The traditional history of Christianity is that literalism took the world by storm, while Christian Gnosticism remained a minor heretical fringe movement. This is nonsense. Christian literalism was initially a minor school of Christianity, which developed in Rome towards the end of the 2nd century. By this time, Christian Gnosticism was an international movement which had spread throughout much of the Mediterranean, flourishing in cosmopolitan cities such as Alexandria, Edessa, Antioch, Ephesus, and Rome. In Egypt, the first Christians we hear of are the Gnostics Valentinus, Basilides, Apelles, Carpocrates, and his son Epiphanes. There is no sign of any form of Christianity which resembles Roman Catholicism in Egypt until Bishop Demetrius at the end of the 3rd century. In Antioch, the Gnostics Saturninus, Serdo, and Menander had established schools at the beginning of the 2nd century. The literalist Justin Martyr regrets that in Edessa, eastern Syria, to be a Christian means to be a follower of Marcion. The Chronicle of Edessa notes the birth of Marcion, Bardesanes, and Mani, before it mentions Roman Christianity. Even Rome itself was full of different schools of Christian Gnosticism, such as the Marsalites, Marcionites, Archonites, Valentinians, Sethians, Barbeloites, Montanists, and Ophites. Literalists complained that in Persia all Christians were members of the Marcionite school of Christian Gnosticism. Tertullian bemoaned the fact that Marcion's followers filled the whole universe. At the beginning of the 3rd century, the Christian Gnostic sage Bardesanes initiated into his school a Syrian ruler who made Christian Gnosticism the official state cult. The forged 2nd letter to Timothy has its phony literalist Paul complain, "All Asia has turned against me," which tells us that in the late 2nd century all Asia was dominated by Gnostic Christianity. The Epistle of Polycarp laments that the great majority of Christians embrace the idea of Jesus not existing in the flesh. The school of the 3rd century master Mani became a world religion in his own lifetime. Eventually reaching from Spain in the west to China in the east, Manichaeism flourished for 1,000 years. Mani was a great eclectic who synthesized the Gnosticism of different religious traditions in an attempt to create a truly international form of spirituality, which would embrace all humanity. His followers taught that Judaism, paganism, Christianity, and Manichaeism are one and the same doctrine. Mani himself is said to have travelled to India and believed that he was teaching the same Gnostic doctrines as the Buddha. A king of Mongolia and an emperor of China honoured him as the successor of both the Buddha and the Taoist sage Lao Tzu. The growth of Christian literalism. Over the course of the 3rd century, despite the flimsiness of its claims to be the authentic Christian lineage, literalism grew in popularity in Rome and the West, though Eastern Christianity remained overwhelmingly Gnostic. Eventually, however, it was inevitable that the simplistic certainties and offer of vicarious atonement of Christian literalism would attract more adherents than Christian Gnosticism, with its puzzling promise of gnosis through mystical transformation. As literalists grew more powerful, so did their vitriolic attacks on all other Christian schools. In response, Christian Gnostics condemned literalists for establishing an imitation church, which no longer taught the secret inner mysteries. Some Gnostics, such as the Valentinians, tacitly went along with literalism in an attempt to heal the ever-growing rift. Other Gnostics, such as Clement of Alexandria and his successor Origen, embraced the idea of an historical Jesus, but remained Platonists and continued to teach the Gnosis in their Christian school of philosophy. Christianity grew in popularity as part of a general upsurge of interest in mystery cults, such as the mysteries of Mithras. Over a period of 350 years, Mithraism developed from a little-known Persian cult into the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, until at the end of the 2nd century CE it was adopted by the Emperor Commodus. The Jewish Jesus cult followed in the footsteps of the Persian Mithras cult, growing in popularity from its conception at the beginning of the 1st century until 350 years later, in the middle of the 3rd century, it had large numbers of followers throughout the Roman Empire and was adopted by the Emperor Constantine. Within 50 years, Christian literalism was the party line of a totalitarian state which dictated to its citizens the one religion that they were permitted to follow. A common literalist reaction to the idea that Jesus is a mythical figure is the question, how do you explain the rise of Christianity without it being founded by an inspirational leader? Mithraism provides us with the answer. Christianity became the dominant religion in the ancient world without there being an historical Jesus, in exactly the same way that Mithraism, a few decades earlier, had become the dominant religion in the ancient world without there being an historical Mithras. Mithraism was inspired by charismatic leaders, but none of them was Mithras. In the same way, Christianity was inspired by charismatic leaders amongst the original Christians, but none of them was Jesus. In fact, the myth of Jesus was partly based on the myth of Mithras. The two stories are so similar that literalist Christians claimed that in an attempt to confuse the faithful, the devil had created the Mithras story by mimicking the life of Jesus in advance of his birth. It seems extraordinary that the Roman world embraced the mysteries of Rome's enemies, the Persians and Jews. But the vast majority of inhabitants of the empire were not Romans, of course, and had little sympathy for them. The cults of Mithras and Jesus spread so successfully precisely because they fed on conquered people's resentment of the Romans and represented a form of acceptable dissent. Roman emperors were concerned above all with uniting their disparate colonies. Mithraism, Christianity, and other popular mystery cults were adopted by the state, regardless of their national origins, in an attempt to bring coherence to a fragmenting empire. Christian literalism was an ideal candidate for the job. It was exactly what a Roman despot like Constantine required, a populist and authoritarian religion which had freed itself of Gnostic radicals. Although Christian literalists rejected the Gnostic inner mysteries of Christianity, they continued to portray Christianity as a mystery cult. Phrases such as, "This is known to initiates," continued to be routinely used, but they were now little more than empty words. As Christian literalism grew in power, it adopted more of the trappings of the pagan literalism it replaced. Its ritual processions were identical to those of the pagan cults. Although Jesus had specifically said, "Call no man father," Christian literalists adopted the Mithraic practice of calling priests father. In imitation of the Mithraic bishops, Christian bishops wore a mithra or mitre and carried a shepherd's staff. Eventually, the Bishop of Rome took up the title of Pontifex Maximus, the ancient name for the pagan high priest, a title still held by the Pope today. The Suppression of Women. Literalist Christianity took as its scriptural backdrop the Jewish Old Testament with its patriarchal monotheism. It therefore vigorously suppressed the idea that there was a Christian goddess. But the people's need to relate to the divine feminine was too strong to be ignored, and the void was quickly filled. In 431 CE, a Christian council met at Ephesus, previously the chief site for the worship of the pagan goddess, and bestowed the title of the ousted goddess upon Mary, the mother of Jesus, honouring her as Queen of Heaven and Theotokos, Mother of God. Protestant literalists would later condemn this elevation of Mary, but ironically it was actually a demotion. For the original Christians, Mary had always represented the goddess Sophia, Queen of Heaven. For the literalists, she was merely a mortal woman, special only because her son Jesus was divine. Literalists put an end to Gnostic ideas of equality between the sexes. They interpreted the Jewish Genesis myth as literal history, with terrible consequences for women. Women were no longer seen as spiritual partners with men, but the descendants of the evil Eve, because of whose sin even the Son of God had to die. Augustine wrote to a friend, "What does it matter whether it is a wife or a mother? It is Eve the temptress we must beware of in any woman." Literalists played down the importance of women in the Gospels to endorse their policy of making them second-class human beings. This reversal of attitude towards women in Christianity is symbolized perfectly by the retitling of the fourth Gospel. Known to us now as the Gospel of John, if it is to bear any name at all, it should be the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This Gospel claims to be written by an unspecified beloved disciple. It is attributed to John solely on the basis of the literalist Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, claiming he had a childhood memory of being told that the Gospel was written by the disciple John. According to the Gnostics, it was written by the Gnostic master Cerinthus at the end of the 1st century. Modern research suggests that the beloved disciple he makes the narrator of the story is not John, but Mary Magdalene. Mary is clearly identified in other Gnostic sources as the beloved disciple, the disciple that Jesus loved, the companion of Jesus, and so on. As scholars have noted, the Gospel of the beloved disciple has been modified, creating obvious structural flaws in order to turn the beloved disciple Mary into the male figure of John, who was more acceptable to misogynist literalists. Attacks on Gnosticism. As their confidence grew, literalists' attacks on Gnostics became ever more virulent, creating the distorted picture of Christian Gnosticism still prevalent today. In a classic case of psychological projection, the Gnostics were misrepresented as the diabolical heretics that the literalists had actually become. Although it was literalists themselves who were preaching an exclusive religion and arrogantly condemning all other faiths as evil, they accused the Gnostics of being puffed-up sectarians and named themselves the Catholic or Universal Church. Although Gnostic philosophy teaches all is one, and literalists preach an irreconcilable war between God and the devil, literalists portrayed themselves as monotheists and the Gnostics as dualists. Although it was literalist Christianity that had begun as a suicide cult, teaching its adherents that the way to salvation was to actively seek a martyr's death, its later followers vilified the Gnostics as world-haters. Christian literalists turned their caustic polemics equally against paganism, which was denounced as a barbaric cult of bloody sacrifice. This is deeply ironic, given the Christian literalist belief that God had sacrificed his only Son as the sole way of getting the rest of us off the hook. When taken literally, it is difficult to imagine a more barbaric idea than that. And for all the undoubted barbarism of pagan literalists, it was Christian literalists, not the supposedly primitive heathens, who presided over the collapse of Western culture into the aptly named Dark Ages. This disastrous collapse was precipitated at the end of the 4th century when Christian literalism, now the only legal religion in the Roman Empire, launched a brutal crusade to completely eradicate its old rivals, Christian Gnosticism and ancient paganism. In an orgy of violence, armies of fanatical Christian literalists tore down the architectural wonders of the pagan world. They built infernal bonfires of books containing the spiritual wisdom and scientific knowledge of the ages. They subjected to grisly torture and a painful death philosophers, priestesses and scientists, anyone who disagreed. They did not stop until they had cut the head off Western culture, leaving it to wander like an amnesiac in an ignorant stupor. They did not stop until they had cut the heart out of Western spirituality, bleeding it dry of its mystical vitality. The corpse of a religion which remained offered nothing but hope of a better afterlife in return for blind belief in its irrational opinions and unquestioning allegiance to power-crazed popes. This tyrannical empire of the soul extended the arm of the state right into the inner sanctum of every individual, denying the right to spiritual autonomy and compelling all to acquiesce or burn. Yet despite this ruthless persecution, Gnosticism survived. It can be suppressed, but never eradicated. It is the spontaneous expression of the natural inquisitiveness and enthusiastic exuberance of the human soul. It is the unquenchable thirst for truth and the undeniable urge to enjoy. It is the spirit of liberty, equality, love, and insight. It is the force of life. It always reasserts itself. The Gnostic heritage. Whilst by the 4th century the Roman Church in the West had condemned anything Gnostic as heresy, in the Eastern Church based in Constantinople, the original Christian spirit survived a little longer. Sages such as Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzum, Evagrius of Pontus, and Diadochus of Photis continued to teach the oral tradition of private secret teachings to those initiated into the inner mysteries of Christianity. They understood the Bible allegorically, explaining that ultimately the secrets of the Scriptures can only be revealed thanks to the Gnosis. They emphasized devotion to Mary as the manifestation of Sophia, and taught that the goal of Christianity was to become God. In the West, the spirit of Christian Gnosticism was smuggled back into the mainstream church via mystical writings attributed to Dionysius, a co-worker of Paul. Today these treatises are generally thought to be the work of an unidentified 6th century monk who deliberately took the pseudonym Dionysius to claim authority for what would otherwise be condemned as heretical works. The writer is thought to have been a pupil of the pagan Gnostic Proclus, the last master of the Platonic Academy, which the Christian Emperor Justinian had forcibly closed down in 529, ending a prestigious 1,000-year history. However, in the light of our thesis that the Gnostics were the first Christians, it is possible that this view will come to be seen as mistaken, and that these texts are at least based on the works of a 1st century Gnostic master as they claim to be. Dionysius is unconcerned with an historical Jesus. His Jesus is a symbolic representation of the Logos. According to Dionysius, there are 2 Christian Gospels, the familiar teachings of the Church, and a secret gospel which is symbolic and presupposes initiation, and must never be divulged to the uninitiated. He eulogizes the wonders of the divine enlightenment into which we have been initiated by the secret tradition of our inspired teachers. The narratives and symbols of Christianity have one meaning to the uninitiated and another to the initiated. Don't suppose that the outward form of these contrived symbols exists for its own sake. It is a protective clothing which prevents the common multitude from understanding the ineffable and invisible. Only real lovers of holiness know how to stop the workings of the childish imagination regarding the sacred symbols. They alone have the simplicity of mind and the receptive power of contemplation to cross over to the simple, marvellous, transcendent truth the symbols represent. These writings were extremely influential. No other works were so frequently translated or had so many commentaries written on them, apart from the Bible and the Consolations of Philosophy by Boethius, which was another text through which the spirit of Gnosticism survived in the dark ages of literalism. Condemned for heresy by the Christian Emperor Theodoric, Boethius describes languishing in prison, where he is visited by Sophia herself, who instructs him in philosophy. Despite his vision of the goddess and never mentioning Jesus once, due to the immense popularity of his writings, Boethius was later claimed by Christian literalists as one of their own. As for the man himself, Theodoric had him tortured and then bludgeoned to death for heresy. Despite the literalist church's unrelenting attempts at suppression, some heretical schools of Christian Gnosticism continued to teach. Paulicians survived into the 10th century, Manichaeans into the 13th, and Simonians into the 14th. In the Balkans, from the 10th to 15th centuries, the Paulicians flourished as Bogomils, meaning friends of God, the traditional name for Gnostics first used by the Pythagoreans. The Bogomils even had their own Gnostic pope. At the Anti-Bogomil Council of 1211, they were accused of performing unholy mysteries like the Hellenic pagan rites. One of their literalist opponents writes with disgust, "They denounce wealth, they have a horror of the Tsar, they ridicule their superiors, condemn the nobles, and forbid all slaves to obey their masters." In the 12th century, the Bogomils developed into the Cathars, or purified ones. Catharism was for many years the prevalent form of Christianity in large areas of France, Spain, and Italy. The Cathars called themselves the Friends of God and condemned the literalist church as the Church of the Antichrist. They claimed to be the living inheritors of the true Christian heritage that had persisted in secret and which still had large numbers of adherents throughout the world. Like the original Christians, the Cathars were vegetarians, believed in reincarnation, and considered the Old Testament god Jehovah to be a tyrant. Pistis Sophia, an early Christian gospel, explains that Christ taught through the mouth of our brother Paul. The Cathars maintained this tradition, claiming that Jesus was not ever in this world except spiritually in the body of Paul. The Cathars were respected for their goodness, even by their opponents. The Catholic Bernard of Clairvaux writes, "If you interrogate them, no one could be more Christian. As to their conversation, nothing can be less reprehensible, and what they speak they prove by deeds. As for the morals of the heretics, they cheat no one, they oppress no one, they strike no one." Despite this, the infamous Inquisition was set up by the literalist church specifically to eradicate the Cathars, which it did with ferocious enthusiasm, burning alive men, women and children. From 1139 onwards, the Roman Church began calling councils to condemn the heretics. Pope Innocent III declared that anyone who attempted to construe a personal view of God which conflicted with church dogma must be burned without pity. In 1208, he offered indulgences and eternal salvation, as well as the lands and property taken from the heretics, to anyone who would take up the crusade against the Cathars. This launched a brutal 30-year pogrom which decimated southern France. 12,000 people were killed at Saint-Nazaire and 10,000 at Toulouse, to give just two examples. The Inquisitor Bernard Gouy instructed that no one should argue with the unbeliever, but thrust his sword into the man's belly as far as it will go. At Béziers, when asked how to tell who was a Cathar and who was not, the commanding legate Arnoux replied, "Kill them all, for God will know his own." Not a child was spared. In 1325, Pope John XII observed that many Cathars were fleeing to Bosnia, where the Bogomils were still thriving, as if to the promised land. In a grotesque prefiguring of the Nazi terror, Cathars who converted to Catholicism were obliged to wear a yellow cross sewn on their clothes and lost all civil rights. And in Eastern Europe, the Inquisition used ovens to burn heretics who were rubbed with grease and roasted alive. If ever proof were needed that the Gnostics were justified in calling Roman Catholicism the Church of the Antichrist, here it is. Yet despite the persecutions, the Gnostic free spirit could not be extinguished. It inspired the great German master Eckhart, who wrote about Sophia and taught that at the heart of Christianity, Judaism and paganism there were the same mystical doctrines. It inspired the Rhineland mystics Tauler, Suso and Ruysbroek, who also called themselves the Friends of God. It inspired countless groups of nonconformists, such as the Brothers and Sisters of the Free Spirit in Europe, who taught, "The Gospel contains poetical matters which are not true." In England, it inspired the Levellers, Ranters, Diggers and Quakers. It also inspired many of the great cultural heroes of the West, Dante, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Pico, and most of the great minds of the Renaissance who set up a new Platonic academy. The Protestant Gnostic Jacob Boehme, who received visions of Sophia. Poets such as Blake, Milton and Goethe, who created their own Gnostic myths. Scientists such as Galileo, Copernicus and Kepler, who revived Pythagoreanism. Philosophers such as Descartes, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel, who was accused of being a Valentinian Gnostic. Christian Gnosticism was reinterpreted for the 20th century by Carl Jung, who along with Sigmund Freud founded psychoanalysis. Jung wrote to Freud that the Gnostics' Sophia was a re-embodiment of an ancient wisdom, that might appear once again in modern psychoanalysis. He asserted, "It is clear beyond doubt that many of the Gnostics were nothing other than psychologists, and began to view mental illness as a failed initiation." He wrote, "All my life I have been working and studying to find these things, and these people knew already." In his 40s, using as a pseudonym the name of the 2nd century Christian Gnostic Basilides, Jung wrote his own Gnostic scripture called 7 Sermons to the Dead. This remarkable text is addressed to the disquieted dead who have been failed by Christian literalism and who appear to Jung wailing, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we have found not what we sought." Jung regarded this work as the wellspring of all his later insights, but although he circulated it amongst his friends, he prohibited its publication until after his death, fearing it would discredit him in the eyes of the scientific establishment. When the Nag Hammadi Library of Christian Gnostic Texts was discovered in 1945, Jung's foundation bought one of the collections, now known as the Jung Codex. When translated, these works proved that many of his intuitions about Christian Gnosticism had been remarkably correct. Towards the end of his life, he appeared on a television chat show in which he famously replied to the question of whether he believed in God with the perennial Gnostic assertion, "I know that God exists. I don't need to believe. I know." The Literalist Legacy. The triumph of Christian literalism was a spiritual and cultural disaster from which we are still recovering. After the civilized exterior of Christian culture in Germany had been ripped open in the 20th century by Hitler's Nazis, Jung wrote, "Christian civilization proved hollow to a terrifying degree. It is all veneer, but the inner man has remained untouched and therefore unchanged. Yes, everything is to be found outside, in image and in word, in church and Bible, but never inside. When literalist Christianity exiled the Gnostic inner mysteries, it lost its soul. It became a bastion of the hypocrites, which the Gnostics portrayed Jesus as mocking in their gospel story. Ecclesiastical autocrats who imposed their dogmas with threats and maintained their power through violence. Politicians dressed up as priests who justified the laying waste of whole continents and the enslaving of millions. Literalist Christianity is often credited with inspiring positive social reforms in Western society. But the truth is that the driving impetus for humanitarian change has come from humanists and nonconformists. The conservative forces of the established churches have resisted every step towards greater compassion, from the ending of slavery to the abolition of the death penalty. In recent decades, unable any longer to simply bully us into submission, literalist Christianity has developed a gentler, more attractive face. Yet its darker side continues to be a nefarious force in the world. A recent report estimated there are at least 8,000 missionaries active in Guatemala alone, many of whom openly collaborate with the brutal secret police and the military in their oppression of the indigenous people. Typifying the spirit of Christian literalism throughout the ages, one preacher from the missionary group El Verbo justified this with, "The army does not massacre Indians. It massacres demons, and the Indians are possessed by demons." In many European countries, however, the power of literalist Christianity is finally waning. Congregations are dwindling dramatically, and churches are being sold off as houses. Science is fast becoming the dominant worldview. This has provoked two very different reactions from those unwilling to consign Christianity to the rubbish bin of history. Fundamentalists are desperately endeavouring to retreat to the old certainties, whilst others are attempting to rework the figure of Jesus to fit new times. Fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a Protestant continuation of the intolerant and dogmatic traditions of Roman Christianity. Heretics are no longer burned at the stake, thank God, but we have still endured the wrath of fundamentalists for daring to publish our ideas about the origins of Christianity. Whilst we have escaped death threats, we have received many after-death threats. According to fundamentalists, Jesus has an eternal torture camp set up specifically to get even with blasphemers such as ourselves. Fundamentalism emphatically insists that the Bible is literally the Word of God and cannot be questioned. This is an attitude that goes right back to the beginnings of the Roman Church at the end of the 2nd century, when Tertullian included thirst for knowledge amongst his list of vices, to be replaced by the virtue of blind faith in Scripture. But this fixation on the written word is a form of idolatry. It mistakes the garment for the naked truth. It confines living insight within the concepts of the past. As Paul says, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Although fanatically concerned about a supposed decline in moral values, fundamentalists hold up the barbarous Old Testament as a divinely inspired account of the works of the one and only God, Jehovah. Let's examine the sort of God they are worshipping. In the book of Genesis, Jehovah destroys all living things on the earth by flood, but somehow manages to also find the time to specifically execute one individual man for letting his semen spill on the ground when having sex. In the book of Exodus, he inflicts hideous plagues on Egypt for not letting the Israelites leave, despite the fact that it was he himself who hardened Pharaoh's heart. He also kills all the firstborn Egyptian children, assists the Israelites in slaughtering an entire tribe of Amalekites, makes it allowable to beat a slave to death, and after rumours that Israelites have worshipped a rival god, orders faithful Israelites to kill their friends and relatives, leading to the death of 3,000 people. Not content with this, in the first book of Samuel, Jehovah takes vengeance on the people of Gath by giving all the men a fatal dose of hemorrhoids. In the book of Leviticus, he condones human sacrifice. In the book of Deuteronomy, he orders the Israelites to utterly destroy the people of the cities that he bequeaths to them as their inheritance, commanding them not to leave anything that breathes alive. In the book of Numbers, he orders a man to be stoned to death for gathering sticks for a fire on the Sabbath, and sends a plague which kills 14,700 people. He also gives the Israelites power to utterly destroy the Canaanites and exterminate the people of Og, advising with regard to captured women and children, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man intimately, but keep alive for yourself all the young girls who have not known a man intimately. You can see why the Christian Gnostic Marcion nicknamed Jehovah the Exterminator. And when it's not being gruesome, the Old Testament is so culturally foreign and outdated, it is just plain daft. The book of Leviticus tells us that we must have no contact at all with a menstruating woman, but it's fine to buy slaves from neighbouring states. Eating shellfish is out, however. That's apparently an abomination. The book of Exodus insists that anyone who works on the Sabbath should be put to death, which I guess means most of us deserve to die. The book of Deuteronomy decrees that a son who will not obey his parents is to be stoned to death by the whole town outside the city gates. So if you're male and your dad's a fundamentalist and you're reading this, you're in big trouble. If you do literally believe that God wrote or personally inspired certain infallible books, as fundamentalists do, then this is the sort of ridiculous mess you end up in. You can see why Paul regarded the Old Testament as so rickety that it wouldn't be around for much longer. It's a shame he was so completely wrong. Fantasists. As the other extreme to fundamentalists are what could be called fantasists. Fantasists are keen to reject traditional forms of Christianity as misconceived, out of date, and redundant. They see the Gospels as the work of fallible human authors, and therefore feel free to dismiss those elements in the Jesus story which they dislike, filling in the gaps from their own imagination to create a pick-and-mix Jesus who fits their own fantasies. In recent decades, such fantasies have reached epidemic proportions. We have had Jesus going to India and Tibet, Jesus getting married and founding a dynasty of European kings, even Jesus the spaceman who wants us to commit suicide in order to join him on the great mothership in the sky. You name it, someone out there believes it. The very first time we gave a lecture on the ideas contained in the Jesus mysteries, we were confounded when a young woman at the back of the audience confidently announced that, impressive as our research was, we couldn't possibly be right because she vividly remembered being Mary Magdalene in a past life. Since then, we have come across several more Mary Magdalens. A man who is sure he lives in a house once inhabited by Jesus when he visited England, and an elderly gentleman whose spirit guides have reliably informed him there were in fact 5 Jesuses. Actually, there are thousands of Jesuses, because everyone has a different one. And the extraordinary thing is, everyone's Jesus looks suspiciously like them. Fire and brimstone types have a fire and brimstone Jesus. Nice liberal pacifists have a nice liberal pacifist Jesus. Jews have a rabbi Jesus. Buddhists have a Buddhist Jesus. Hindus have an avatar Jesus. The great German theologian Rudolf Bultmann called this the deep well effect. Looking for the real Jesus is like looking down a well. All we see is our own reflection. This is not just an affliction of flaky New Ages. It applies equally to respected historians. In his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, Albert Schweitzer describes scholars as practicing plastic surgery on Jesus, who always emerges looking like the surgeon who operated on him. Docetism. This proliferation of Jesuses is not a new situation. According to the literalist Hippolytus, all Gnostics had their own particular Jesus. But this was not a cause of conflict and controversy because, for the Gnostics, Jesus was a mythological figure who appeared in the imagination in a form appropriate to the individual according to their level of spiritual awareness. The Gospel of Philip explains, Jesus does not show himself as he really is, but he shows himself as people are able to see him. He shows himself to all. To the great he appears great, to the small he appears small, to the angels he appears as an angel, and to men as a man. Hence the Logos conceals itself from all. Some indeed see him and realize that they are seeing themselves. In the Acts of John, John and his brother James see Jesus beckoning to them, but one sees a beautiful man and the other a little child. Later for one of them, the figure becomes rather bald-headed but with a thick flowing beard, and for the other, a young man with an immature beard. In the Acts of Peter, Peter relates, I saw him in such a form as I was able to take in. He teaches a group of widows how to see Jesus. See with your mind what you do not see with your eyes, and though your eyes be closed, yet let them open in your mind within you. The widows become senseless with bewilderment, and all experience Jesus in a different way. Some say they saw an old man who had such a presence we cannot describe it to you. Others say, we saw a growing lad, and others, we saw a boy who gently touched our eyes and they opened. Peter remarks, God is greater than our thoughts, as we have learned from these aged widows who have seen the Lord in a variety of forms. According to Theodotus, Paul recognized that each one knows the Lord in his own way, and not all know him alike. Paul himself famously experienced Jesus as a vision of light. In the Apocryphon of John, John also experiences Jesus as light, but in this case containing a metamorphosing image. I saw in the light a youth who stood by me. While I looked at him, he became like an old man. And then he changed his appearance again and became like a servant. There were not many before me, but an image with many forms in the light. And the image appeared through each, and it took 3 forms. He said to me, John, why do you doubt? Why are you afraid? You are not unfamiliar with this image, are you? Don't be nervous. I am the one who is with you always. The Gnostics' doctrine that Jesus is a symbolic visionary figure is known as Docetism. It is misunderstood by Christian literalists as the bizarre claim that Jesus was some sort of disembodied spook that miraculously appeared to be a man who lived the life described in the Gospels. But this crazy idea is just the product of literalists taking the Gnostics literally. Docetism actually teaches that Jesus is a mutable figure who represents the archetype of the self and appears in different ways to initiates with different levels of understanding. As the Gospel of Philip says with startling clarity, some realize that they are seeing themselves. The problem is that at first, when someone experiences a relationship with their particular vision of Jesus, they recognize him as their brother and regard all the rest as bastards, as Hippolytus puts it. Their Jesus is the real Jesus. Everyone else's is an impostor. But once the idea of an historical man is abandoned, competing Jesuses are not a problem. Everyone can look down the well and come up convinced that Jesus looks just like them, and that doesn't conflict with everyone else doing the same. We can all have a different Jesus. The whole point of a mythological figure is that it can be adapted to suit different people and changing times. What unites fundamentalists and fantasists is their obsession with the idea of an historical Jesus. We are suggesting a radical alternative, freeing ourselves from the futile preoccupation with history and returning to the original Christian's understanding of Jesus as the hero of a powerfully transformative allegorical myth. The real Jesus is a red herring. We fully understand how difficult it is to doubt the existence of someone who millions believe to be the most important human being ever to have lived. Many of us have been brought up since childhood with a vivid picture of the historical Jesus. Mention his name, and we can almost see him in his rough white robes with long flowing hair and beard. Yet the earliest representations of Jesus actually portray him beardless, with short hair, wearing a Roman tunic. Paul explicitly writes that flowing locks disgrace a man, so presumably he did not share our modern image of the Christ. The now ubiquitous image of the bearded, long-haired Jesus did not become established until the 8th century, when the Eastern Church in Constantinople suddenly produced a self-portrait, which had been miraculously created when Jesus wiped his face on a cloth. Not to be outdone, the Roman Church turned up a portrait of a bearded Jesus painted by Luke and later completed by angels. Pilgrims still kneel before this absurd fabrication in the Vatican today, hoping it will in some way bring them to the truth. The truth is, however, that the picture we have of Jesus is a product of the imagination, our own and that of others before us. Was there an historical Jesus? The evidence suggests there was not. But to us, this emotive issue is really not important. What is important is to realize that the Jesus we relate to in our imagination is a mythical archetype through which we can reach the Christ consciousness within ourselves. Because if we are unable to get enough distance from our own fantasies and opinions to see that our picture of Jesus is an imaginative construct, we will never have the self-knowledge necessary to grasp the Gnosis. However, we have to be spiritually ready before we can hear this message as positive rather than negative, as giving us what we have been really looking for rather than taking something away. The teachings of the Christ within are an open secret that only someone who is ripe can really hear. Many people desperately want to believe in a miraculous Saviour, who has literally incarnated to rescue them. There is nothing wrong with this. The miracle worker is a stock character of ancient myths, used to inspire hope of something more than the mundane in those unable to see that the whole of life is a staggering miracle. The image of the divine God-man was deliberately designed to appeal to spiritual beginners who have yet to discover that this mythical figure represents their own true identity. Those who are not ready cling to their real Jesus like a life buoy in the tempestuous sea of existence. To suggest they let go sounds like madness. But the secret teachings of the original Christians were not designed to maliciously deny comfort to simple believers. They are actually offering something infinitely more reassuring than blind belief in historical events. They are offering Gnosis, immediate experiential knowledge of the truth. The message is not, look out, you are clinging to an illusion. The message is, relax, you are not drowning. You can let go because life is actually completely safe. Just experience Gnosis and all your ignorance will be dispelled. Just know who you really are and you will have absolutely no fear ever again. Discover the Christ within yourself and you will be always one with God. Summary. Christian literalism developed towards the end of the 2nd century as a minor cult with the unique claim that Jesus had literally lived out the pagan myth of the dying and resurrecting God-man. Literalists fabricated a lineage to link themselves back to the supposed disciples and forged letters of Paul to make him appear anti-Gnostic. Mirroring the success of the mysteries of the Persian god-man Mithras, Christian literalism gradually grew in popularity, becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. With the full might of the Roman state behind them, Christian literalists waged a barbaric war against paganism and Christian Gnosticism, pulling down temples and libraries, burning books and dissidents, and plunging Western civilization into the Dark Ages. The legacy of Christian literalism has been a misguided obsession with the historical Jesus. The original Christians, however, taught that Jesus is a mythological figure who appears in the imagination in different ways, according to the understanding of the individual. If the Jesus story is an allegorical myth, what does it mean? If we have lost the secret inner mysteries of Christianity, can we rediscover them? By understanding Christianity as part of the broad Gnostic tradition that flourished throughout the ancient world, we have been able to discover the true origins of Christianity. Let's now see if, by examining Christian myths and doctrines in the light of pagan and Jewish Gnostic philosophy, we can recover the gospel of Gnosis. Chapter 4. Know Yourself. The kingdom of heaven is within you, and whoever knows himself shall find it. Know yourself. Jesus, Oxyrhynchus Manuscript. Above the ancient pagan sanctuary at Delphi were written the words, Know Yourself. This injunction was seen as the fundamental challenge of Gnosticism by pagan, Jewish and Christian Gnostics alike. The gnosis, or knowledge they sought, was self-knowledge. Their spiritual quest was to answer the most obvious of mysteries, which continually confronts each one of us. Who am I? If we can grasp the Gnostics' teachings about who we really are, then the meaning of the Christian myths of Jesus and the goddess will become clear. These teachings have little in common with Christianity as it is generally understood today. At first, they may seem strange and abstract, but if you are willing, just open yourself to the possibility of a revolutionary new vision of who you are and what life is. That is the first step on the journey to Gnosis. Body, soul, spirit. What does it mean to know ourselves? Who are we really? The Gnostics understood a human being as having 3 aspects: body, soul, and spirit. The words soul and spirit are so familiar that we can easily presume we know what we mean by them. But do we? What exactly is a soul? And how is it different from a spirit? Although today these concepts are so woolly as to be almost meaningless, for the Gnostics they had clear and definite meanings. To explain their teachings, the Gnostics used the image of a circle. The circumference of the circle represents the physical body, which the ancients called physis, from which we get our word physical. This is our outer self. The radius represents our psyche. This is traditionally translated as soul, although as the ancient word psyche has come into common usage since the advent of psychology, it is probably less misleading to leave the term untranslated. In relationship to the outer body, we experience the psyche or soul as our inner self. For the Gnostics, it is a deeper level of our identity than the body. At the centre is our essential identity, which the ancients called pneuma or nous. Pneuma is usually translated spirit, but today this word has become all but meaningless. Nous is traditionally translated intellect, but this is misleading as we now associate the word intellect purely with rational thought, whereas nous is the witness of all experiences, whatever their quality. Plotinus describes nous as a knowing principle. It is that in us which knows. It is the subject of every experience, which each one of us calls I. It is the sense of being in every human being. It is who we are. A more appropriate modern translation for both pneuma and nous is consciousness. Recognizing the levels of our identity. We can clearly distinguish the three levels of our identity if we examine the three states we inhabit each day: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. In the waking state, consciousness extends its awareness from the center to the circumference, experiencing the psyche and the body. In the dreaming state, we abandon the body and retreat into the psyche or soul. In the deep sleep state, we withdraw completely into our essence as nous or pneuma, spirit or consciousness. Paradoxically, in this state of being pure consciousness, because we are not experiencing anything, we are unconscious. We remember this state afterwards only as a blissful void in which we exist as the emptiness of consciousness, conscious of nothing. The common sense view of ourselves is that we are bodies which are awake, dreaming, or in deep sleep. From the outside we do indeed seem to be bodies in one of these three conditions. Gnostics, however, take as their starting point our own subjective experience of ourselves, not others' experience of us, and in our own immediate experience we are permanently who we are whilst the body and psyche come and go. We are not a physical body that is sometimes conscious. We are consciousness that is sometimes conscious of a body. The modern conception of human identity, articulated by scientific materialism, is that we are a complex physical organism which, in some way we have yet to understand, has an inner life and is therefore conscious. From this perspective, Gnostic teachings sound like spiritual mumbo-jumbo. But to the Gnostics, it is the notion that matter could somehow be the cause of conscious experience which is truly fantastic and incomprehensible. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus argues, "If the body came into being because of consciousness, that is a wonder. But if consciousness came into being because of the body, this is a wonder of wonders." Science starts with the body and ends with consciousness, moving from the outside inwards. The Gnostic approach starts with consciousness and ends with the body, moving from the inside outwards. Science teaches we are as we appear to others, physical bodies. The Gnostics teach that we are as we are for ourselves, consciousness. Both approaches have something to tell us about the human predicament. The ancients saw them as complementary, not in opposition. Science deals with appearances and has taught us much about how we appear to be. Gnosticism deals with what we are. The Gnostics take us back to basics and explain the complexity of the human predicament from these simple beginnings. There is nothing more obvious than the fact that we are conscious of experiences. Our essential identity is the experiencer, nous, spirit, consciousness. The flow of experience which consciousness witnesses is the psyche or soul. For the Gnostics, therefore, our fundamental condition could be described as consciousness aware of experience, nous aware of psyche, spirit aware of soul. The body is in the soul. From the outside it appears as if the psyche or soul is in the body. We seem to see it when we look into someone's eyes, the windows of the soul. When Gnostics talk about how things appear objectively, they go along with this common notion of the soul as a sort of intangible, more rarefied body which is trapped inside the physical body. But when they talk on a deeper level about how things are subjectively, the psyche or soul is conceived of as an ongoing event witnessed by consciousness. It is the totality of our experience, which includes the experience of the body. This turns inside out the notion that the psyche somehow inhabits the body. As Plotinus teaches, the psyche is not in the body, rather the body is in the psyche. To the modern materialist mindset, this can seem a bizarre idea, yet it is an important insight on the path of Gnosis. We can begin to understand it if we carefully examine our own raw experience. Through the experience of sensations, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting and smelling, we know the body in what we think of as the objective world. Yet sensations themselves are subjective events in the psyche. Most children have at some time wondered whether other people actually experience the same thing as they do when they see green or orange. No one knows the answer to this simple question. Why? because sensual experiences exist within the psyche, and we have no direct access to the psyches of others. From the point of view of the body, looking inwards from the circumference, we appear to be a physical organism which has an inner life, a psyche, and is therefore conscious. From the point of view of the centre, we are consciousness experiencing psyche, which at the circumference includes the body in the form of sensations. The psyche body is what we appear to be. Consciousness is what we are. Porphyry writes, "What lesson have we learned from those who best understand the human condition? Surely that you must not think of me as this person who can be touched and grasped by the senses, but my true self is remote from the body, without colour and without shape, not to be touched by human hands." We opened this book with the perennial Gnostic promise attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. "I will reveal to you what no eye can see, what no ear can hear, what no hand can touch, what cannot be conceived by the human mind." What is the one thing, in reality not a thing at all, which cannot be seen, or heard, or touched, or conceived of? It is that which witnesses the seeing, hearing, touching, and conceiving. Consciousness itself. The great revelation of Gnosticism is that our essential identity is consciousness. The one consciousness of God. The Christian Gnostic Clement of Alexandria writes, "The greatest of all lessons is to know yourself, for when a man knows himself, he knows God." For the Gnostics, the quest for self-knowledge is identical with the quest to know God, because when we discover our deepest identity, we discover we are God. What can this possibly mean? It seems a bizarre idea because we are used to the literalist picture of God as some sort of omnipotent patriarch who is boss of the cosmos. For the Gnostics, however, God is omnipresent consciousness within which everything exists as an idea. This one universal consciousness expresses itself through all conscious beings. So, although we may all seem to be separate individuals, as Plotinus teaches, at the innermost depths of each of us there is one consciousness, unchanging and the same. This is our shared essential identity. It is the hidden root of the tree of which we are all branches. Using the analogy of the circle of self, the Gnostics imagine us like many radii, emanating out from a common centre. The one consciousness of God is represented by the centre shared by all the radii, explains Dionysius. God is an indivisible point which is the source of all, the root of the entire circle of existence, teaches Simon Magus. You will find him in yourself, like that little point, proclaims the Christian master Monoimos. The radii, representing individual psyches, terminate at the circumference in individual bodies. But at the centre is a shared essence. When we look outwards to the psyche body, we each appear separate, but actually our centre is the centre. As Plotinus teaches, if we hold through our own centre to that centre of all centres, we will discover that our consciousness is the one consciousness of God. Monoimos imagines an essentially indivisible essence appearing to have many faces and many eyes. Plotinus offers us the same image, writing, "Imagine something full of faces, gleaming with living faces." Each line which extends from the centre of the circle has its source in the one consciousness of God, and its fruition in a distinct human form, which is an image or face of God. The one appearing as the many. But if we are all one in God, why don't we experience ourselves as God? To answer this question, we must first understand the paradoxical nature of consciousness. Imagine for a moment the centre of the circle without any of the radii. It is consciousness without anything to be conscious of, and therefore unconscious. In a poetic attempt to capture this paradox, Gregory of Nyssa and Dionysius call it the dazzling darkness. Just as light is darkness when it has no objects upon which to reflect, so consciousness is unconscious when it is witnessing no experiences. The one consciousness of God is the dazzling darkness. It appears as the light of consciousness when it has something to illuminate. What it illuminates is an infinite number of psyches, sequences of experience, represented by the radial lines. Plotinus explains, all beings may be thought of as centres uniting at one central centre. The centres appear as numerous as the lines starting from them, and yet all those centres constitute a unity. Thus we may liken conscious beings in their diversity to many centres coinciding with one centre. They are all one because they share the same centre, but appear to be many because of the many radial lines which lead from the centre. The one consciousness of God appears to be many individual consciousnesses because when it looks out to the circumference along a particular radius, the common centre appears to itself to be the centre of that particular radius. As consciousness witnessing an individual psyche, the centre in relationship to a particular radius, we appear as individual beings. As the dazzling darkness, the centre in itself, we are the universal being the Gnostics call God. The absolute mystery and its apparent qualities. Our shared essential identity is an ineffable mystery. It is not a relative mystery which one day might be solved. It is a mystery by its very nature. The mystery of God, to use Paul's phrase, is the absolute mystery. The Gnostics represent the mystery by a point because, by definition, a point has no dimensions. In itself it has no characteristics. We can only call it the centre in relationship to the circle that issues from it. Likewise, the indivisible point, which is the one consciousness of God, in itself has no characteristics. We can only call it consciousness in relationship to psyche, because in itself it is the dazzling darkness. Yet despite this, the Gnostics often talk of the absolute mystery as if it did have qualities. They not only call it consciousness, but also the one. Platonists describe it as the good, the beautiful, and the true. Valentinus calls it love. When these mystics recount their experiences of spiritual awakening, they do not relate a cold encounter with the qualityless and unknowable, but an ecstatic revelation of an all-consuming unity and an all-embracing compassion. We can understand how the essentially ineffable appears to have qualities by considering waking up from deep sleep. We might say that the deep sleep experience was peaceful and blissful, or describe it as a void in which we have no separate existence. But whilst we are in deep sleep, there is no deep sleep experience. We are not conscious of any of these qualities, since we are unconscious. Deep sleep in itself is an absolute mystery. But from the conscious perspective, we can say that, relative to the waking world, it appears to have certain qualities. In the same way, the mystery in itself, like a point, is completely beyond description. But from the human perspective, on the circumference of the circle of self, the mystery appears to be our centre. Relative to our experience, it appears as consciousness. Relative to our existence as separate beings, it appears as the one. Relative to our desires, it appears as the good towards which, knowingly or unknowingly, we all aspire. Relative to our feelings of happiness and sadness, it appears as perfect bliss. Relative to our experience of rejection and acceptance, it appears as unconditional love. Relative to our feelings of attraction or repulsion, it appears as incomparable beauty. Relative to our states of confusion and clarity, it appears as the simple truth. Our essential nature, then, that we have so far described using the language of psychology as consciousness and the language of theology as God, could equally be described in the language of philosophy as oneness, or in the language of ethics as goodness, or emotionally as love, or aesthetically as beautiful, and so on. But when we reach beyond all such necessarily inadequate descriptions, we can only say that, in truth, at the heart of each one of us, there lies the same mystery. As Plotinus puts it, all consciousness are the various members of that. Incarnation. The psyche contains a spectrum of experience, from rarefied ideas near the centre of the circle of self to concrete sensations at the circumference. Here the radii that have emanated from a common centre confront each other as apparently separate beings. Here the private dream, which is each radius, becomes a shared dream that we call the world, in which we seem to exist as separate physical bodies. Before we are born as a physical body, we exist as consciousness and psyche, as we do in dreams before we wake up in the morning. When we are born, just as when we wake, we bring into manifestation the denser level of our psyche. Plotinus teaches, the experience we call birth is the coming into being of the lower phase of the psyche, which we call the physical body. As newborn babies, we have no concept of who we are. We therefore come to conceptualize ourselves as who everyone says we are, the visible body. We identify with how we appear to others, rather than how we are for ourselves. The Gnostics call our apparent identity the eidolon, which means image. The eidolon, like a reflection in a mirror, is who we appear to be, but not who we really are. In modern spiritual jargon, the eidolon is the ego. In the Christian text, Pistis Sophia, it is called the counterfeit consciousness. Basilides calls it the parasitic psyche. Plotinus calls it the intruder. Our word idea, an image in the mind, comes from the same root as the word eidolon. The eidolon is the I am the body idea. We have identified ourselves with this idea rather than the consciousness within which the idea arises. We have mistaken the image for the essence. This is the tragicomedy of the human predicament. We are all God, but most of us think of ourselves as a somewhat shoddy person. We have completely identified with the body we appear to be on the circumference of the circle of self, and have no awareness of our essential nature as consciousness at the centre. When we identify with the body, we attempt to gratify and protect the particular person we mistake ourselves to be. We seek what is good for this limited idea of who we are, regardless of the consequences to others and the entirety. Thus the wise, loving, impersonal presence that is the mystery of God becomes an ignorant, selfish, separate person. The Gnostic path of self-knowledge is discovering that the eidolon is not our true self and progressively becoming aware of our essential nature as consciousness. It can be imagined as the process of moving our point of identification from the circumference of the circle of self up the radii to the centre and realizing ourselves to be what we have been all along, consciousness. The Gnostics teach that this is a journey of many lifetimes. Just as each night we go to sleep to wake up reinvigorated the next day, so at the end of a lifetime we die and reincarnate, manifesting ourselves as a new body in the world, the wiser for our previous experience. In this way, life by life, we progressively move further along the road of realization. The path of self-knowledge. The Gnostics divide human beings into categories according to their level of self-awareness. Paul, Valentinus, and other Christians use the terms hylics, psychics, and pneumatics. Hylics, or materialists, identify themselves with the body, the circumference of the circle of self. Psychics, or soulists, identify with the psyche or soul, the radius. Pneumatics, or spiritists, are aware of themselves as spirit or consciousness, the centre. In pagan, Jewish and Christian Gnostic traditions, there are two basic stages of initiation, which lead initiates progressively through these states of being. Christians called the first the psychic or soul initiation because it initiates the journey from being a hylic to becoming a psychic. They called the second the pneumatic or spirit initiation because it initiates the journey from being a psychic to becoming a pneumatic. Psychic initiates were taught the exoteric teachings or outer mysteries of Gnosticism, which were openly available to all those interested in joining a particular Gnostic school. Pneumatic initiates went on to be taught the secret esoteric teachings or inner mysteries. Literalist Christianity is the product of psychic initiates, uninitiated into the inner mysteries, making a religion out of the outer mysteries. This is why the secret pneumatic teachings of Christianity, which we are exploring, seem so remote from Christianity as it is generally understood today. The pneumatic teachings were kept a secret because the spiritually immature can easily be so baffled that they dismiss them as incomprehensible nonsense. Psychic initiates were not taught the secret inner mysteries for the same reason that we do not tell children the secrets of sexuality until they are old enough to understand them. Such knowledge too early is simply confusing and could even be harmful. The Christian master Ptolemy explains, "These things are not openly spoken of, for not all people are ready for gnosis." Paul states, "Psychics don't grasp things which concern the consciousness of God. They seem like foolishness to them because they are pneumatically discerned. Pneumatics, however, understand everything." Psychic initiates can also easily misinterpret pneumatic teachings. The danger with telling those who are still completely enmeshed in identification with the eidolon that they are really God is that this will lead to inflation rather than transcendence. The ego starts to believe it is the Lord of the universe. The history of religion is full of such egomania passed off as spirituality. Soul initiation. Although today the words spirit and soul are used interchangeably, for the ancients the conceptual differentiation between spirit and soul was the foundation of the initiatory structure underlying Gnostic spirituality. The psychic or soul initiation was about exploring soul or experience. The pneumatic or spirit initiation was about discovering the experiencer, spirit or consciousness, the ground of all experience. Together, these two levels of initiation created the conditions for the realization of gnosis, which was their common fulfillment. The process of awakening starts with an experience the original Christians called metanoia. This term, which is found throughout the New Testament, is traditionally translated repentance, a word now so loaded with religious connotations that it is difficult to hear what it really means. Metanoia is not about apologizing to God for breaking the rules or about performing prescribed penitential acts. It means a change of heart. It is deep dissatisfaction with the way we have been and the sincere desire to be different. It is the turning point in our lives when we realize we can't go on investing in our separate ego because we intuitively know that life is actually about spiritual awakening. Metanoia is the signal that we are ready to embark on the process of soul initiation. Dionysius describes this stage of initiation as being about purification. Both pagans and Christians marked it with a baptism, an initiation ritual involving immersion with water, symbolizing being cleansed. During this stage of initiation, initiates are instructed in ethics, which teaches them to lead a good and selfless life and so helps them to gradually purify themselves of the selfish ego. The psychic initiate understands self-knowledge to be about earnestly examining our faults and failings, so that we can become a better person. To use modern spiritual jargon, the psychic initiation is primarily about personal growth through working on ourselves. The underlying purpose is to lessen our identification with the eidolon so that we can transcend it altogether in the pneumatic or spirit initiation. Psychic initiates understand the injunction, know yourself, as the call to personal self-knowledge. Know what your personality is like. Pneumatic initiates hear it afresh as meaning, know who you really are. The psychic or soul initiation is about working on ourselves to become a better person. The pneumatic or spirit initiation is about coming to understand that we are not a person at all. We are impersonal consciousness or spirit. Spirit initiation. The pagan Gnostics call the two levels of initiation kathamos, meaning purification, and paradosis, meaning transmission. In the first stage, initiates are purified through ethical teachings. The second stage of initiation involves the transmission of esoteric philosophy. Today the word philosophy is associated with dry academic theories, but the ancients did not see it in this way. For them, philosophy was not an intellectual exercise, it was a spiritual practice. Philosophy is a rigorous examination of the mysteries of who we are and what life is. It questions our deepest assumptions and fundamentally changes how we perceive ourselves and our lives. It is a process of using the reasoning mind, which is an aspect of psyche, to guide us beyond thoughts altogether to consciousness itself. It disperses the confusion which obscures the mystery of God. Clement of Alexandria teaches, philosophy purges the psyche and prepares it for gnosis. Under the transforming impact of mystical philosophy, initiates learn to disengage completely from the psyche or soul, and so no longer identify themselves with anything they appear to be within their experience, instead identifying with the experiencer. This state of contemplation is getting back to the primal simplicity of being the conscious witness of the unfolding events that make up the psyche. When we do this, we are no longer actors in the drama of our lives. That is only how we appear within the psyche. We are not living our lives at all. Life is living through us. We are consciousness, aware of the mystery spontaneously expressing itself as a sequence of experiences. We are not a person who does this or thinks that. Thoughts and actions arise in our experience, and we enjoy the show. The downside of believing we are the body is the inevitability of its demise. Fear of death is often what motivates spiritual exploration. The quest for self-knowledge is the search for a deeper identity which can survive physical death. When we enter the state of contemplation, this is exactly what we discover. The process of pneumatic initiation is the purification of the unbornness, as the Christian Gnostic Zostrianos puts it with startling clarity. At the end of this process, we realize we are consciousness itself, which will witness the death of the body as it witnessed its birth, but which can never die because it was never born. In the Greek used by the original Christians, the word usually translated as salvation also means preservation. To be saved is to be preserved or made permanent. When the original Christians talk about being saved, they are talking about realizing the permanence of our essential nature. When we discover we are the permanent presence of consciousness, not the temporary, ever-changing psyche body, we know that we are truly safe. The journey to God. The Gnostic path of self-knowledge can be thought of as a journey to God, for it comes to the same thing. Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage whose mystical works were studied by the original Christians, teaches, pure philosophy is spiritual striving through constant contemplation to attain gnosis of God. The process of initiation changes initiates' understanding of God. In truth, they are God, but whilst this is unknown, or a theory only, they experience their own essential identity as a superior being outside themselves. Whilst they think of themselves as a person, they experience God as a big person. As they come to understand themselves impersonally, they also come to understand God in impersonal terms. In the realization of gnosis, they finally come to know themselves to be indistinguishable from the mystery of God. Hylics either don't bother to think about God at all, or have a religious relationship with what they imagine to be the ultimate external authority figure. In the psychic stage of initiation, this gives way to a softer conception of God as a wise parent who nurtures us on our personal journey through life's trials and tribulations. Picturing God as a big person allows us to have an intimate relationship of love, devotion, and friendship with the ineffable mystery, which could otherwise seem remote, abstract, and inaccessible. In the pagan tradition, there were many different gods and goddesses who were understood to be particular faces of the oneness, through whom initiates could relate to the mystery. Drawing on this pagan tradition, the Christian Sabellius compares the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to personas. A persona was a mask worn by an actor in the ceremonial pageants of the pagan mysteries. It is the root of our word personality. In the same way that our personality or persona both masks and represents our ineffable essential nature, so the various images with which we picture the divine are God's personas, which mask and represent the mystery. As pneumatic initiates, we come to understand our own nature in impersonal terms, and so no longer imagine God as a big person, but in impersonal terms such as the One, the Good, and so on. As we approach the realization of Gnosis, we progressively transcend duality, and so all relationship with God is subsumed by the oneness. There is no longer God and devotee, only the mystery of God in love with itself. As Hermes Trismegistus writes, the goal of Gnosis is to become God. In the Gospel of John, Jesus proclaims that his mission is to make his disciples one with God, as he is one with God, so that all is perfectly one. The realization of Gnosis. The process of Gnostic initiation has more twists than the plot of a Hollywood blockbuster. Initiates on the Christian way set off to fulfill the injunction, know yourself. As their awareness grows, so their idea of who they are is transformed and transformed again. In the psychic stage of initiation, they discover that they are not the physical body. In the pneumatic stage of initiation, they discover that they are not the personal psyche either. In the realization of Gnosis, they understand that they are not even the impersonal witness. They are not a self at all. They are the absolute mystery. The realization of Gnosis is the fulfillment of both the psychic initiation of personal transformation and the pneumatic initiation of personal transcendence. Initiates realize the oneness of all that is and the complete illusion of their existence as a separate individual. This completes the pneumatic initiation of transcendence. Yet they continue to appear to be a separate individual, to others and to themselves, just as they have always done. Through the realization of Gnosis, however, the apparent person is perfected, which fulfills the psychic initiation of personal growth. The Gnostics called the mystery of God the Good. They teach that when we realize Gnosis, we will discover that our essential identity is the good. We don't need to become good. We will spontaneously act well as a natural expression of our being. We will no longer identify with the eidolon, and so will be literally selfless. We will know we are one with all that is, which is the experience of all-embracing love. We will know that all that happens is the will of God, which is the experience of unconditional acceptance and unshakable faith. We will be intoxicated with wonder at what has been staring us in the face the whole time, but which we have been too preoccupied to notice. Life is an awesome, incomprehensible miracle. Gnosis is the knowledge that all is one, but this does not mean we suddenly experience the world as an amorphous blob. Rather, we understand that the essential oneness necessarily expresses its infinite potential as the rich variety of life. Realizing that we are not a person does not mean we suddenly become some sort of disembodied nobody. Rather, we know we exist on many levels. We are the mystery expressing itself as consciousness witnessing psyche, within which we appear to be a person living a life in the world. The Christian way is not about withdrawing from the world or the personality into some abstract impersonal void. It is about progressively expanding our awareness back to its source in the mystery and being all that we are. Gnosis is consciously knowing in our everyday lives that we exist simultaneously in the states of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Usually, we move our awareness each day from the center of the circle of self to the circumference and back again, passing through the states of waking, circumference, dreaming, radius, and deep sleep, center. Through the process of initiation, we learn to maintain in our waking lives on the circumference the awareness of also being the radius and the center. As we explore the deep psyche in the psychic stage of initiation, reaching further and further back along the radius towards the center, the magical quality that we associate with dreams starts to break out in our everyday experience. Mundane reality becomes strangely mythic and meaningful, ridiculing the ideas of the cosmos as some sort of grand machine run by blind cause and effect. In the pneumatic stage of initiation, as we learn to stand right back inside ourselves and be the ineffable witness of our experience, reality becomes completely dreamlike. The person we took ourselves to be is a character in a drama we are witnessing. We exist outside the whole play of time, invulnerable and immortal. The realization of Gnosis is becoming aware of being the dazzling darkness of the mystery. We subsume ourselves in this wonderful absence of experience each night in the state we call deep sleep. It is the glorious rest of stillness without movement, the one with no other. Pure subjectivity without objectivity. Essence with no appearance. It is the primal paradise of union. The realization of Gnosis is being aware that this state of oneness is not just something we sink into when we relinquish consciousness. It is possible to be conscious of oneness by becoming aware that the state we think of as deep sleep is actually the ground of all experience. The reason we aren't aware of it is because it is not an experience. We habitually focus on what we experience, rather than that we are experiencing. But when we focus on the permanent presence that witnesses our ever-changing experience, we become conscious of consciousness. Although in deep sleep itself there is no experience, when we emerge from deep sleep, we sometimes remember it as pure bliss. This is because, as we have already explored from the perspective of duality, the one is experienced as love, beauty, bliss, the good. When we maintain an awareness of the one whilst experiencing the multiplicity of appearances we call life, we are conscious of the rich variety of our ever-changing experiences, whilst simultaneously bathing in the permanent bliss of our ineffable being. The essence of Christianity. The original Christians encoded their teachings in their allegorical myths. Before examining these myths in detail, let's end this chapter by looking at the most important of all Christian mythological figures and what he represents in the light of the philosophy we have been exploring. That figure is, of course, the Christ. The Christ within. Christ represents the one consciousness of God at the center of the circle of self, which is our essential shared identity. The treatise on the resurrection sees us radiating like rays from the Saviour. For Paul, the Christ within is our common essence. We are the members of the body of Christ, he explains, for in reality there is one consciousness and one body. In a prayer of the Apostle Paul, Paul prays to Jesus, "It is you who are my consciousness." Dionysius urges us to experience a communion with Jesus, who is transcendent consciousness. Pagan and Christian Gnostics call the one consciousness in all of us the Logos. The Gospel of John equates Jesus with the Logos, that is, the true light which illuminates everyone who comes into the world. Hermes Trismegistus explains, "That in you which sees and hears is the Logos of the Lord. It is the consciousness of God the Father." Clement of Alexandria elucidates the idea that Jesus is the Son of God by explaining, "The Son is the consciousness of the Father. The Father is the mystery, the dazzling darkness of unconscious consciousness. Jesus represents the potential for consciousness made actual in every conscious being." The Christian master Marcus has Jesus declare, "I am the Son of the Father, who is beyond all existence, while I, his Son, am in existence." To know the mystery of God, we must come to know our shared identity, which is symbolized by Jesus. Hence, in the Gospel of John, Jesus teaches, "No one comes to the Father but by me." This phrase is endlessly plastered over church notice boards and has probably been the source of more bigotry than any other religious dogma. For the original Christians, however, it does not mean that the only way to God is to be a Christian in the exclusive, cultish sense of the word. As the Gospel of John makes clear from its introduction, which equates Jesus with the Logos, "No one comes to the Father but by me," means that the way to the mystery of God is via his Son, the Logos.